like that. I got to thinking about Father's Day, and I got to thinking about my father and other fathers involved in my life. And it just made me start thinking, well, what were some things that we could share? Now, part of this flows from the message that I'm going to be preaching this morning. I'm going to be talking about someone that we're not aware that much of, but yet his name comes up, and so it got me thinking. What other fathers are out there that maybe are not famous fathers? I don't know about you, but I don't have a famous father. In fact, none of you, except for Lynn and Whitney, have ever met my father. And there's been people who have asked me when they saw that I was in ministry, that I'm a pastor, and they said, so where was your dad a pastor at? They just assumed that I followed in his footsteps, but my dad wasn't a pastor. In fact, my dad, even though I'm the son that looks the most like my dad, he was skinnier than me, though. I'm the chubby version. But even though I'm the one that looks the most like him, we're very different in some ways. He was a quiet man. He didn't like going in front of groups, anything like that. So he was a lot different than I am. He wasn't as outgoing per se. But I got to thinking. Sometimes when we think of our fathers, especially in a Christian gathering like this, maybe we want to talk about how you as fathers should be leading your kids in biblical truth. And you know what the truth of that is? Most of the time, most of us aren't very good at it because that calls for a Bible scholar, right? You need to be a Bible scholar. You need to know an awful lot about the Bible. And frankly, most of us aren't Bible scholars. And my dad certainly was no Bible scholar. And he knew what he knew. He understood the gospel and he understood some other truths. But as far as teaching the Bible from a scholarly perspective, no, that just wasn't him. And I think most fathers aren't that way. But what is it that fathers give to their kids? What has your father given to you? What have you passed on to your kids after you? Well, there's some things that I thought about. For instance, what about a work ethic? I think my dad taught a work ethic. My dad maybe was not a go-getter. You know, there's some of these husbands that can't sit still anytime if they're home from work, they got to be out working on something around the homestead or whatever. My dad wasn't like that necessarily, but he was always a worker. And I remember as we were growing up, there were five of us kids. And dad and mom didn't have a lot of money. I didn't even realize we were poor until I got into college. And I started having to start paying some bills and stuff on my own. And I thought back and I realized, oh my goodness, we grew up poor. Now, I kind of knew that as a kid in the sense that there were other kids that had a lot of things that I didn't have. But that just wasn't a focus in our family. And dad always worked. First he was in the military for a while as an enlisted guy. He retired from there, and then he did some other jobs, but he worked. He provided for his family. So in that sense, he provided for some good lessons there. What about how you treat other people? Do you realize that your father actually I don't want to say taints your way, but colors your thinking on how to treat other people? I believe that's true. How do you see your dad treating, for instance, his coworkers, the other people he works with, or maybe when he comes home, what does he say about them? That sort of a thing. My dad wasn't one to come home and bash people. He just didn't do that, and so that was a good thing. What about how you treat your neighbors? I think my dad was a pretty good neighbor. Probably he would help out if times were had. But one thing that I do remember, especially from my dad, was how do you treat people, especially the women in your lives. I remember one thing that really, really bugged my dad was when he saw a man abusing his wife. And there were only a couple times when I felt like we got to tie dad down. He's going to go rip into this guy. And that was when he saw some guy being. There were times when people could be verbally abusive toward their wives, but if he saw any physical type of pushing around or anything like that, it would like light a fire in him. I mean, you're like waving a red flag in front of a bull. And I remember that. And in fact, most of you know that I'm a twin, and my sister and I are the youngest of the five kids. And I remember when we were about 12 years old, she did something. You know how sisters are; they're usually pretty rotten. And at any rate, she did something. I can't remember what it was, and I hit her. Oh my goodness, did my dad come unglued? And the only thing I remember from the whole conversation is, "You don't ever hit a girl." So, which made it kind of hard because when I was getting older, then there were girls that wanted to play football and so forth. What do you do with that? Hey, when a helmet's on, you can't tell. You just hit them. But at any rate, no, that was one thing with Dad. And the other thing was is how he treated his mom. As his mom got older and she had health issues, because my dad had gotten out of the military, he had had a couple different jobs. Where we were living in Alabama at the time, and my grandma Wagner was living up in New York, and she had a stroke. Dad's brother and sister-in-law lived up there, but their living conditions just weren't right for her. So Dad uprooted the family, and we moved up there, and he got another job. I remember he worked for a milk processing plant. The Cuba Dairy or something like that. We weren't in Cuba, but Cuba, New York. And but he did that to help take care of Grandma because Grandma needed it. So that kind of taught an important lesson to me. So you see, Dad teaches lessons. Now, what I do with those lessons is another story. And how I develop with those things is another story. One of the things that Dad never was overbearing and telling me, you need to go this direction. You need to do that. And so forth. He allowed us to make up our minds on things. He allowed us to move in the area that we wanted to move in. And all of us are in different things at this point today. But learn those things from my father. Now, the next step, of course, is how the Lord is going to take those things that he taught me and then turn them into something even more important in our lives. I don't want to get ahead of myself. That's what we're going to talk about this morning. But as you think about your father, what lessons did they give? Even if you can think of negative things about your dad, I can think of some negative things about my dad. I must admit, not an awful lot, because had a good relationship with Dad, and he was a pretty good guy, just a blue-collar guy. But I can think of a lot of things that way. But some of us see a lot of negative things about our dad, but there's some good things there as well. Even in their negativity, how did he help shape you? You realize the person you are today has something to do with how your dad shaped you. Now, I know your mom shaped you. I know grandparents shaped you and other people in your lives, but your dad did shape you as well. And interesting to think through those things. If your dad's still alive, say thank you to him if you have the opportunity to be able to do that. Well, let's go to the Lord in prayer, and then we'll continue on with our service. Father, thank you for putting the people in our lives that you have to be able to shape and mold us in the direction that you want us to be. We're grateful for that. Father, for those who have had a rough time, who have had difficult times and still struggle with that, I pray that you would work especially in their hearts and to help them to see God as their Father and be able to have a heart of forgiveness and a heart of mercy in some of those things. And Father, those of us who are fathers and our grandfathers, I pray that you'd help us to recognize that we do have great influence in the lives of our kids and grandkids and even in our wives and so forth. And I pray that you would help us to use that to produce good and to point to them in the direction of wanting to follow you. Bless us, Father, as we try to do that. I'm praying in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to be in a couple different places in the New Testament, but I know one place will be Luke chapter 9. So if you can turn there, we will eventually get to that, although not just yet. I remember one thing that said a lot to me about my dad was it had to deal with my brother Wayne. Now, I shouldn't take a lot of time for this, but most of you know my family's kind of a real messed up unit, right? My dad had been married before and had a son. My mom had been married before and she had a son. Mom's husband left her, they got divorced, and then Dad's wife died of spinal meningitis. Now, Dad's wife was my mom's sister. I could never imagine marrying a sister-in-law, but that's beside the point. And anyway, then Mom and Dad got married, really, as I heard their story, just out of they needed each other because they both had these sons, and they were both alone, and so they got married, and it wasn't really even about love. I heard Mom telling us this later, but it developed into love, and they truly loved each other a lot. Well, anyway, because of that, they started off with two sons, then they had my brother Bruce came next, which was their first son together, and then my sister and I always told the story that if we were alive when the death angel came through Egypt, all three of my brothers would have died as firstborns. But I don't know if that's really true or not. But if you're doing the math, that also means that my two oldest brothers are also my cousins. See, I told you. It was kind of weird. But one time my brother Wayne came to my dad when Wayne was, I think he was already out of high school and stuff, and by this time. But he said to my dad, he said, "Dad," he said, "if you guys wanted to," he said, "you could have gotten support from his real dad." And he said, "You could have done that. Why didn't you ever do that?" And my dad said, and remember, this was a different day back then, the way things worked. But my dad said, "Well, we didn't need his help. You were my son." Oh, that's interesting. And not that there's anything wrong with getting support. I don't mean that, but it was just interesting, Dad's perspective to Wayne that you were my son. I got to share another story. When as we were getting older, my dad had to go through the official process of adopting Wayne. And we didn't know how all that works. And so the day came that they went to court to finalize everything. It was Mom and Dad and Wayne went to court. Well, us kids are at home. Somebody, I'm sure, was babysitting us, but we were at home and we're trying to figure out what do they got to do? I mean, what's this whole adoption thing? I mean, we're talking real little kids. What does that mean? And one of my brothers suggested, well, I think Dad's got to go in front of the judge and spank Wayne in front of the judge. And we're like, what? Yeah, he's got. And I thought, Wayne's got to get spanked. My one brother said, yeah, I heard that they've got to prove that he loves him. So that's what they're going to. By the way, that brother that suggested it, he's a drama queen to this day. So I'm sure that he believed that story as well. So found out that didn't happen, by the way. And there was no spanking. Let me read this story to you. It says, some years ago, two brothers grew up with a father who taught them the meaning of hard work. He owned his own business, and from their earliest recollections, Johnny and Jim worked with him. They knew how it felt to reach the end of a day too tired to sleep. They also learned to value the perks that accrue to the ones in charge. The brothers were intense. They were good workers, and their father came to rely upon his sons to maintain and develop the family business. Then one day, just as Johnny and Jim were finishing up a major project with their father, they left the business. What happened? A young leader building a new organization had arrived in town and handpicked Johnny and Jim to join this elite group. They saw the chance to hit it big. Abruptly, they turned their back on their commitment, their plans, and their father's dreams to jump at the chance of a lifetime. Almost immediately, Johnny and Jim ran into problems. They viewed life differently from their boss. He was patient and methodical. They were anxious and impetuous. He believed in serving people. They just wanted to get the job done. Worse, the two brothers had failed to recognize the implications of being little fish in a big pond. In the family business, they were the only ones next to the man in charge. Here, they were simply two members of an executive team. No jockeying, no power plans, no pecking order, and others on the team were smarter and more aggressive than they were. Johnny and Jim conspired to get an edge on the others. When they were alone with the boss, the brothers suggested that when he was ready to establish his formal organization, they could become his top men. Just in case their suggestions weren't enough, they even arranged for a close relative to plead their case. But their plot could not be concealed for long, and when the news leaked out, the brothers were harshly criticized. Their peers plotted counter moves to protect their own rights. Naturally, the boss caught rumors of unrest and insurrection and called an executive committee meeting. Sorrowfully, he informed his team that they had totally missed the purpose of his training sessions. He explained that his organization was built on giving, not getting, on service rather than privilege. It was a hard lesson to learn because it ran so counter to the prevailing culture. Now, some of you may have picked up on who that is. I'm talking about James and John, the disciples of Jesus, the two brothers. And we're going to look at that. But what I want to deal with today, I think I've got it listed up here. You see I've got Zebedee. But I want to deal with the idea of exhorters, fathers who exhorted their kids. As I already mentioned earlier, what kind of things did our fathers pour into us that then when we become adults, those things will help mold us to make us who we're going to be. Is this doing an awful lot of that? Should I turn it off or leave it on? I'll leave it on. Okay, there you go. First of all, what's it mean to be an exhorter? What does it mean to exhort? I got a definition from a couple different dictionaries. This one says to encourage, to advise, to embolden. Boy, I like that word, to embolden. That is to make them bold so that they can move forward. It's to try to influence by words or by advice. And when you put that in the context of fatherhood, it's pointing our kids in the right direction, emboldening them to make good choices in life. as they move forward. Well, can you think of any biblical examples of that? Obviously, I've got Zebedee listed in the outline here, but can you think of some other fathers? I was thinking about this. I was doing different mindset. I almost included Paul. Now, if you know Paul, you say, wait a minute, Paul wasn't a father, but Paul was a spiritual father to Timothy. And maybe I'll have to do that one another time because there's a lot of good stuff that could be said on there. But I uncovered a lot of things here by looking at the idea of Zebedee, and I really enjoyed the study. I would encourage you to study some of these things out. Well, let's look at Zebedee. Who is Zebedee? Well, we know that he's the father of James and John, the two disciples in the Bible. But what do we actually know about Zebedee? There, believe it or not, are no direct stories in the Bible about Zebedee. To my knowledge, and maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong on this, but there are no direct quotes from Zebedee. There's no stories giving something that he did. About the closest thing we have to a story is one of the times when Jesus asked James and John to follow him, he was in the boat with James and John, and they left him there with the nets. That's as close as we come to a story about Zebedee. Well, then how can we talk much about him as a father? Well, the way we're going to do that is we're going to look at James and John, and we're going to look at their story. Now, how about this? How would you like it if all we had to know about you was what we see from your kids? What a scary thing, couldn't it? I know the 5 of us kids would have scared my mom and dad to death on that thing. You know, it's one of those things where the parents go to school and the teachers say, oh, your kids are so nice, and the parents walk away saying they weren't talking about our kids. They must have been thinking of someone else. But we're going to look at James and John at any rate. And what can we learn about James and John? And here's really the deal. We're going to ask the question, what did James and John bring to Jesus when they joined the group? Because the things that they brought with them, the mindsets and so forth, that's what I believe teaches us something about how Zebedee trained them, how Zebedee gave them direction in life. Now, we don't know a lot about their mother. She is mentioned a couple different times, and I know that she had an impact in their lives as well. But right now, I just want to look at it from the perspective of the father. By the way, just a little side bit, I got sidetracked on this at one point, probably spent an hour looking some of this stuff up, is James and John are probably Jesus' cousin. It looks like their mother, Salome, was Mary's sister. Mary, the Virgin Mary, was her sister. And so there's a lot of different things, interesting things going on with that whole dynamic, but we won't go down that road today. But at any rate, they were probably related. But what worldviews did they bring? Now, we're going to have to read between the lines as we go through this story. And I do need to caution you, you have to be careful when you do a lot of reading between the lines, because you can say a lot of things that you think, like as you look at a person, you kind of get an idea what you think their mindset is. And if you're not careful, you can state it as if this is the gospel truth. This is what he was thinking. And, you know, we know that we don't really know that, but we can still make some inferences. So even though we need to be careful and cautious, what do we see James and John bringing that they probably got from Zebedee? That's the sort of thing that I want to look at. Well, as we look at this story today, I want to start with a timeline, or even not so much a timeline, but a chronology of events. As you put the 4 Gospels together, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, remember, they all tell the same story. They all tell the story of Jesus' rise in ministry and the ministry he had, and then going to the cross and resurrection. They all tell that story, but they tell it from their own perspectives. So you get a lot of different details added in. Not details that would make the stories contradict, but details that would fill up the stories. That as you mesh them all together, it makes for a more colorful picture to look at as far as that goes. Well, we're gonna look at that and just kind of see where it takes us. Well, the first part of the chronology is that we see that there's this fishing business. And Zebedee was the owner of this particular fishing business. James and John worked for them. We know by reading in other places in the scripture that not only did they work for him, but there were other servants that worked for him as well. So what that means is he was a successful businessman. And his business was growing, and it probably made him a person of some import, at least within their particular town and so forth, because he had this business going, and it was operating fine. He could afford to pay other servants as well as his sons. We also find out by reading farther on in the Gospels that they were in partnership with Andrew and Peter, and I'm assuming it was Andrew and Peter's father who owned that business as well. Not real sure, but their two family businesses were in partnership, and that's why you see them together so many different times doing the different things that they were doing. Well, at any rate, as you can imagine, owning this fishing business, and it would have been a small business, not a giant fishing boat, but they would have gone out on these smaller boats that would have had maybe 3 or 4 guys on each boat, and it was the type of thing where they would cast out the nets, and they would haul them in, and when they hauled them in, they would dump the nets in their boats, and they'd fill it up, and then they would come back, and they'd process them and sell them. That was how they made their living. But as you can imagine, they probably had a lot of time to talk. And I think that's one of the keys. Even though it's not specifically stated here in the scriptures, there's a lot of things that aren't stated in the scriptures that we have to kind of fill in the gaps with. But I would imagine they had a chance to talk about a lot of different things. And as we're going to look at John and James' mindset as we go on, I think that this made a real difference. For instance, one of the next things on the timeline is that we find that John is actually a disciple of John the Baptist. Remember, there's a story, I believe it's in John chapter 1 or chapter 2, where the 2 disciples are listening to John, and John sees John the Baptist, and John the Baptist sees Jesus coming, and he tells them that this is the Lamb of God, and they go and follow him. Well, we know that the one is Andrew, and by deduction, we're pretty sure that the other one was John. So John was a disciple of John the Baptist, and they actually would have done this not as we see the rest of the Gospels unfolding, where the 12 disciples were with Jesus full time. That's not how it happened, at least at first. What happened here, like with John the Baptist, is when John the Baptist was passing through the region, they would go and they would be there and they would listen to what he was preaching and what he's proclaiming. And then they would stick around for the extra seminars, if you want to put it like that John would teach these other guys. And Andrew and John were called disciples of John the Baptist. They were some of the ones that stayed around a lot more and learned a lot more and were really getting into what he was teaching. And then, as John would move on, they'd go back to their fishing boats and fish a little more. By the way, that's how it happened with Jesus as well. You know, you read the story where Jesus came and called the disciples, Peter and James and John and Andrew, from the fishing boats. That actually happened a couple different times. And as you read that, you say, wait a minute, didn't that just happen? Well, the reason it happened, at least until the last time when they gave up everything and spent the rest of his ministry with him, they would go and be with him for a little while, and then they'd go back to their fishing boats. And they would continue on with the fishing. In fact, even after Jesus died on the cross and resurrected, what did the disciples do? They went back to their fishing boats again. So it was the type of thing that they always kept their hand in the business a little bit, even though they were considered disciples. Well, anyway, as they were disciples of John the Baptist, they would have heard all the things that John had to say. And John came as one who was preaching a message of repentance. And here was the main idea that John was trying to get across. Stop being religious. Actually follow God. You need to be consistent. You need to not just simply be there when there's religious services. In their case, that was when it's time to go to the temple and offer your sacrifice. Go to the temple, offer your sacrifice. But then when you leave, you go and just be who you are and be however you are and live a life that just doesn't matter. John the Baptist came and said, stop it. You need to live consistent with your life. If you say you're following God, you need to follow God. If you've got a sin pattern in your life, you need to turn from that sin pattern and start walking right with God. And that's what John was preaching. And apparently, John the disciple and Andrew and others were getting into it. They were listening to that. And it made an impact on them. And then, in fact, when they met Jesus a little later on, if you're keeping score, in John chapter 1, 35 to 41 is where you find this story. When they actually met Jesus and went and spent a day with him, they went back. Remember, Andrew went to Peter and said, Peter, we, meaning he and John, we have found the one who is the Messiah. So they were looking for the Messiah. By following John, it just reveals their mindset. They didn't want what was going on in their land, the land of Israel at that point in time, where there was an awful lot of hypocrisy, people just being religion in name only. No, they wanted it to be real in their lives. And that's why it excited them to hear someone like John the Baptist come and preach what he was preaching. And so that was an important thing to them. James and John would have gotten to know Jesus during this time as Jesus passed around. And the reason I say that is we get the next story in Matthew 4 of where James and John were called from their boats. Jesus came and said, I want you guys to follow me. And immediately they left what they were doing and went and followed Jesus. I don't know about you, but doesn't that seem strange? They never seen this guy before, and all of a sudden he says, come follow me, and they leave everything and go follow him. The reason that seems strange is because that's not the way it happened. They had been getting to know him already. They knew who he was. They had been hearing his preaching. John and Andrew had already said that they believed he really was the Messiah. So when the time came for Jesus to come and tell them to leave the boats, they left. Now, an interesting part of that story in Matthew 4 is it says they were in the boat with their father Zebedee. I think it's kind of important to keep that in mind because you don't get any indication that Zebedee tried to stop them. Now, I know that we're reading between the lines here because there's a lot that's not written about the whole thing, but you don't get any indication that Zebedee tried to stop them. And there's no indication that Zebedee was mad at him and they had a poor relationship with him because all along when they're introduced as the sons of Zebedee. And so it was a positive thing. I believe Zebedee was bringing his boys up to be able to think through those things. And therefore, when they decided to go, I happen to think that Zebedee was probably happy with that. At any rate, let me keep going here. After they went and they were starting to be with Jesus, we see that Jesus in Mark chapter 3, there's a listing of the 12 disciples, and in Mark chapter 3 it says that Jesus named them Boanerges. I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Boanerges is how I'm going to say it, but he named them Boanerges, which was either a Greek or a Hebrew word, and in fact I think it was Hebrew because Mark translated it when he was writing Mark for his Roman listeners, and he translated it to mean sons of thunder. It meant sons of thunder. Jesus called them sons of thunder. Well, the question is, why were they called the sons of thunder? Well, we'll get at that. Some people say it's because of some quotes that come from James and John. Let me just give you a couple quotes. And here's where, if you're in Luke chapter 9, we're going to look at a couple different places here. A lot of times you get Jesus speaking and you hear his teachings. Once in a while, it'll mention what a given disciple had to say about something. And in John chapter 9, it mentions a couple different times where John and his brother James as well spoke up. First of all, in John chapter 9, verse 49. Well, let me begin at 46, actually. Then a dispute among them, that is the disciples, arose among them as to which of them would be the greatest. And Jesus, perceiving the thought of their heart, took a little child and set him by him, and said to them, whoever receives this little child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. For he who is least among you all will be great. Now, we all understand that. What is hard to understand is why does John say what he says in the next verse? Now, John answered, which means in response to what Jesus said about this child, John answered and said, Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him because he does not follow us. But Jesus said to him, do not forbid him, for he who is not against us is on our side. Now, why did John say it? Why would Jesus say, look, you got to be like this child. You've got to be humble. Don't be jockeying for position. And then now John says, well, Master, we saw someone else who was carrying out ministry in your name, and we told him, stop it. He's not one of the disciples. He's not one of our group. And then Jesus says, well, don't stop him. If he's doing it in my name, he's not our enemy. Okay? Interesting to think, why would John do that? I'll get to it in a little bit, but I wonder, you could look at it as a jealousy thing. You know, hey, it's only us, not you. But I think you could also look at it that John comes from a business family. And in a business family, things had to be done properly. You know, one of the servants doesn't just jump in the boat and go use it for what he wants to use it for. He's got to get permission from Dad or permission from me and James, the next two down the line. But normally we're going to work together and we're going to do this. I wonder if it comes from that business mindset that he had there, that this needs to be done properly in the right way. Now, the next thing he does is in Luke chapter 9, verse 51 and following. Let me read that. Now it came to pass when the time had come for him, that is Jesus, to be received up, that he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. In other words, Jesus is heading toward Jerusalem for this final week of ministry when he's going to be crucified. And sent messengers before his face. And as they went, they entered a village of the Samaritans to prepare for him. But they did not receive him because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. I think what that means is the Samaritans didn't want Jesus to come in. And I think John's putting in a parentheses, it was part of God's will anyway, because Jesus was determined to keep going and go all the way to Jerusalem. Verse 54, and when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, just as Elijah did? And look what Jesus says. But he turned and rebuked them and said, you do not know what manner of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And they went to another village. Now, why did they do this? Suddenly, are they of that fiery temperament? Are they that type of thing that, well, you sorry people, you're not going to have Jesus. Lord, let us zap them. You know, we would say fire from heaven. Maybe you could say a bolt of lightning, or maybe you could say like lava coming from a nearby, well, whatever. Is that because they're so fiery and so forth? Well, you could interpret it that way, but is there another way of looking at it? Notice they said, as Elijah did. There was a time when Elijah called fire down from heaven. Now, why did he do that? If you go back and read in the Elijah passage, it was a very similar circumstance. People were doubting that they were the servants of God. People were doubting that they were doing what God wanted them to do. And therefore, when Elijah called for the fire to come down from heaven, it established who the true prophet was. And it established exactly what it was that God was doing. It wasn't to be mean. It wasn't to be angry. But it was because you guys need to see who's doing God's will here and what it is that God's trying to accomplish. So it's possible that when James and John said that, they weren't just being fiery angry at these people, but they realized Jesus was the Messiah. They wanted people to see that Jesus was the Messiah. And guess what? If God called down heaven, or God sent down fire all of a sudden here, the surrounding regions would get the fact that there's something more about this Jesus. He's not just simply an itinerant teacher. And so, before you get too critical of James and John, I think that they were wanting to say, look, this is correct. We believe it's correct. In fact, our faith is so strong, we just know it's correct. Let us show them, Lord. And that seemed to be the idea. The next one, you don't have to go there and read it, but in Mark chapter 10 and also in the book of Matthew, we get the story to where they came with their mother and they wanted to convince Jesus that Jesus, when you enter your kingdom, when you actually establish your kingdom. They didn't necessarily know about the whole resurrection thing yet, but they believed as the Messiah, he was going to establish his kingdom. When you do that, we want to be on your right hand and on your left hand. And which would be positions of power. Now, again, you could get down on James and John for wanting power, but was it really that they wanted power? Or was it that they wanted to help and be part of the leadership in this? You see what I mean? We got to be careful when we just throw negative ideas out there. They were used to being leaders. Their father had used them as leaders. And now they were willing to use the gifts and abilities that they had developed to help Jesus in leading this new kingdom. That's not near as bad as what some people want to say. Now, I know that I'm reading between the lines. So I'm not going to say those other people are wrong. I'm just saying, is that really the only option? Maybe it's these other lessons that they had learned and they were willing to do it. Well, as the chronology goes on with Jesus here, we see that they then saw the transfiguration. That was where Jesus went on this mount and he actually transfigured before them. His clothes turned bright, shiny white, and they saw Moses and Elijah, and the story goes on. But the key to this point is that Jesus allowed Peter, James, and John to see that. Why? He was developing them. He was getting them ready for the future ministry that they were going to have. Then he allowed them, of course, to see the resurrection, and that was a life-transforming thing in them. They were then able to help open the church or begin the church, and the church started growing fantastically. I mean, right from the start, they had 3,000 people turn to the Lord for salvation, right at the start. And then within weeks' time, as you read in the book of Acts, the church was up to over 5,000 people. It was a smashing success. And James and John and the other disciples, except Judas, of course, were able to be the leaders in this new church, as Jesus had brought them along and developed them to be able to do that. Now, as the story goes, James, John's brother, was martyred. He wasn't the first martyr of the church, Stephen was, but he was the first one of the apostles, or the original 12 disciples, that was martyred for their faith. And why? Well, again, I think Jesus brought him to the point to where he would be able to do that, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. And then John ended up living probably the longest of all the apostles. Some people think he was probably the youngest of all the apostles, but he lived so long that when we see him toward the end of the first centuries, in the 80s and the 90s, that John was known as the apostle of love. Interesting, where he was so strong and wanting to get the job done here early on. What we see later is he's no longer pushing to accomplish a whole bunch of stuff, but he's the apostle of love. In fact, one of the church historians said that every time John came into a meeting, he was so elderly they had to actually help him to walk into the meeting, and they'd get him in there. And then before he would leave, he would say to the whole group, "Children, love one another." And then he would leave. And it even got to the point where people got to wonder, why does he keep saying that to us? And they asked him, and he'd say, you need to love one another. Now, as we were reading the book of 1 John in the afternoon service, we're looking at one of the main things that John says that is evidence of your true salvation is that you have love for one another. And so that is, in fact, an important thing. So let me get away from that timeline. I want to come up with some takeaways. What are some things that we can glean from this? And especially in relation to our Father's Day message for Zebedee, what can we take away from Zebedee? Where do we see his influence? Well, I believe he influenced them by helping to mold their worldview, the way they looked at things. And he helped to mold that. And then afterwards, Jesus took what Zebedee had done and then used it to mold them even further into the leaders that they were going to be. But what are some of their worldviews, or maybe should I say this, what are apparently some of their worldviews? Because I know I am reading between the lines that Zebedee would have given them. Well, the first one was I believe Zebedee probably had a part in them wanting more than just religion. They didn't want to just simply be religious like the people around them. The people of Israel had been there for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years, and they're just continuing on as they always continue on, and there was so much hypocrisy. We get down on the religious leaders, but it was true with the people too. So many of them, they would go and they would do their sacrifices and all that and then go back and just live how they wanted. James and John didn't want that anymore. And I believe that their father Zebedee helped them. I could see them sitting in the boat talking about that kind of thing. Talking about the fact that why won't these people actually live for the Lord rather than just be religious in name only? And I could see them talking about it. I could see the discussions that they would have. And then as they went on to John the Baptist's ministry, they flourished in that circumstance. I think that Zebedee had something to do with this. He helped them in some way to not want to settle just for religion, but rather to actually have a relationship with God. And live how he wanted them to do. I believe another part of their worldview that Zebedee probably influenced was the fact that he taught them to have freedom of thought. He gave them the freedom to think, and he gave them the freedom to act. And you see that again when Jesus came and said, I want you guys to follow me now. And they got up and they left Zebedee in the boat and they went and followed Jesus. I believe that Zebedee gave them complete freedom. And I am convinced, the more I've read this story, that Zebedee was glad that it happened. Now, he had to go get some more servants to help him finish up because they were washing the nets. It was a big job. But he finished what he's doing. But I believe he gave them the freedom to act, the freedom to think. And therefore, they became pretty good disciples of Jesus because of that. They were willing to think, not just simply follow the status quo. Now, if the status quo is good, it's good to follow the status quo. But in this case, they were living in a society that was degraded. And they were willing to think differently and be above that. And I believe Zebedee helped them to think about that. Now, then you come to the part where they were named Boanerges by Jesus, the sons of thunder. What does that mean? Is it that they're the sons of Zebedee, and Zebedee was the one they called thunder? Maybe he was a big booming man. It could be, but I don't think so. I think as you look at where Jesus called them that, I think Jesus is saying something about James and John, not so much about their father. but it was something that they would have inherited from them. Is it because they were forbidding that one guy to minister that wasn't a part of their group? Or is it because they wanted to call down fire on that Samaritan village? Is that why? There's a lot of writers that I've read that say, yeah, that's why they think it is. But I've also read several others, and I agree with the others, that I think it's more than that. I think that Jesus called them sons of thunder because of their mindset. Their mindset mixed with their personality. And you can see it from some of these stories. For instance, I believe Zebedee instilled within them the idea that when we're going to do this business, we're going to do it right. And therefore, they operated according to successful business principles, I think. And you see it when John didn't like this guy who wasn't a part of their group going over here preaching. Hey, if this guy's going to be over here preaching and doing stuff and he's not a part of our group, we can't maintain a quality control thing here. And John was worried about it. Well, Jesus is going to have to shape that a little bit, but I believe that mindset came from their father, and I think that's a good thing, even though Jesus had to shape it for use within the church. Okay, I believe that when they wanted to call fire down from heaven, I believe that they were just trying to live consistently with their faith. And they saw how Elijah did it in the past to verify who was who, and they knew who Jesus was, and they wanted him to be verified. I think they were just trying to apply the scriptures. Now, Jesus had to calm them down about it and had to settle them down and realize, now you're going to go too far in doing that. But still, the idea of wanting to verify what God's actually doing is not a bad thing. And I believe that again, Zebedee trained them to think and to act and to be real with what they're doing. And I believe he made them willing to lead. They were willing to lead. And they did. They became great leaders within the church. And we'll see a little bit more about that in just a minute. But I believe Zebedee gave them the worldviews. I believe he gave them some tools. And because of those tools, they developed into the young men that they were. And then Jesus was able to take them and take them even further. I believe Jesus used the tools that they had, used the mindsets that they had. And all Jesus had to do now was to shape it. You know, like don't be so harsh in your leadership. In the church, it's going to be a little different. This is more about service and love than it is just getting the job done. I believe Jesus is going to shape their mindset in all of those types of things. He's going to soften their overreactions and so forth. And then he's going to continue training them, as we see that he did. It even brought him up to the part where James was martyred. Do you know why James was martyred? Well, it says that Herod wanted to persecute the church, and when he did martyr James, it made the Jews and other people around them happy. So it was for political reasons from his standpoint. But the way they killed him, they killed him by the sword, which means he had his head cut off. And that particular sentence was reserved for people who were accused of leading people toward false gods. Now, we know that James wasn't leading them toward false gods. We know that James is leading them toward Jesus as the Son of God. Put this thought in your mind. James was executed because he was successful in his ministry. He had a successful ministry. He was known as someone that was pointing other people to the Lord Jesus. His evangelistic ministry was working. It was getting the message out there. And he was beheaded because of that. Well, I'm sure Zebedee wasn't happy that his son was executed, if Zebedee was still alive at the time. But Zebedee, as a follower of God, could be happy with the idea that his son was following the Lord, in part because Zebedee taught him to be a man that lived according to those principles. And so I think that was good. And then John, of course, became the revered elderly leader of the church, the apostle of love. Well, Zebedee encouraged his sons. He encouraged them with the desire for genuine spirituality. He encouraged them with the ability to think for themselves. He encouraged them with fervency of spirit. You know, that's where I think the sons of thunder come in. But I don't think an angry, loud, screaming fervency. I think it was more of a fervency that, yeah, we need to do this. We need to do this, and we need to do it right. We need to make sure we're successful as we do it. That's the type of fervency that I think Zebedee put into them. Zebedee gave the Lord great raw materials to work with. He raised his kids. He trained them. You could look at it from just a human perspective if you want. But he trained them to live as good, productive young men. with good ideals on how things should be done, and with a mindset of being the best that you could be. And that was good. He trained them for that, and then he turned them over to the Lord. And the Lord took and molded them beyond that, molded them to make them even better, to soften the rough edges, and use them for the establishing of, by the way, one of the most successful organizations in the history of the world, and that is the Church of Jesus Christ. And Zebedee had a part to play with that. Not that he was a part of the church per se. I don't know how much he got involved with all of that, but that in raising his sons, he instilled within them the ideas that they need to live and work that way. They need to be consistent in their faith and so forth. I know I'm reading between the lines, but I have to believe that he was a part of that. Why else so many times when it says this is James and John, it mentions that they are the sons of Zebedee. Zebedee's name comes up all the time. I have to think it's because he had a positive influence on them. Well, the question for all of us is are we exhorters? Now, as I look out over this group, most of us have raised our kids, or our kids are awfully close to being ready to be out of the house, and we understand that. We can look back and ask, what have we done? Can I see where I was successful? Can I maybe see where I wasn't so successful? But you know, as I do, if your fathers lived long enough into your adulthood, that they never quit being a father for you. They could always be helpful to you. They could always be encouraging you. We need to be encouraging them. We need to be exhorting them in that right direction. And we need to be willing to turn them over to the Lord, for the Lord to work in their lives, so that he can then mold them and change them and make them into something far better than even what we could do. But as fathers, we need to be exhorters. Now, I was going to include in this message Paul with his relationship with Timothy. You can see why I didn't. There's just not enough time for all that. But Paul was not a father. Paul did not have any kids, as near as we can tell from the scriptures. But Paul did take a few young men and treated them as his kids, and he encouraged them. He pointed them in the right direction. Even as he was getting older, and as these young men were getting older and getting established in their ministries and so forth, Paul was encouraging them to keep moving forward. So he still was trying to act like a father, as an exhorter. We need to be that way as well. We need to exhort each other, but we need to exhort those who are coming along behind us as well. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for the example of Zebedee, as near as we can make it out by looking at these stories. And I thank you that James and John developed into the leaders that they did. I thank you that they were able to learn and grow as young men, and then learn and grow as the Lord Jesus shaped them even further. And I pray that you would help us, Lord, to help those behind us, to help those that we can encourage in good, godly living, so that they could walk after you. Father, many of us may not be Bible scholars. We might not know all of the Bible verses that we would like to tell them, but we can certainly train them in godly ways of living, in wise ways of living, in wise ways of consistently operating within the bounds of good common sense and good faith. Help us, Lord, to be able to make a difference in the people behind us. I pray in this in Jesus' name. Amen.